I am going to do something with the tiles. We're going to go straight into the interactive portion of this, and it won't stop interacting. So we're going to interact a lot. And so I'm going to ask you to use the chat or use your voice. I am okay with either. And I'm a big part of being a servant leader and leadership in general is to be vulnerable, to offer what's on your mind, to share your fears, mistakes, and uncertainties with your team, especially if you're in a position of leadership. The research is clear over the past 20 years. I'm a long-term academic, by the way. I'm a four-time business owner, but I also have 20 years as an academic and still teach an MBA, executive MBA program at James Madison University. The literature is really clear. There's a lot of evidence for when leaders aren't perfect, share that they're not perfect, and share their fears and share their mistakes and what they've learned from those mistakes. Those kinds of vulnerability offerings are bonding agents. And so the degree to which you're willing to share something that feels vulnerable, you're likely to bond with one or more of us. So please offer your thoughts throughout. And so let's go ahead. Ponder the following: your best bosses in any field of work. Sylvia, in the pharmacy world, 45 years in pharmaceuticals, or not pharmaceuticals, but as a pharmacist is what I thought I heard. You had bosses.
Yeah.
Others had bosses. All of you have had bosses, probably, or most of you. Go ahead and put in the chat box, and we can discern whether it's a good attribute or a bad attribute, or a good behavior or a bad behavior. So go ahead and start typing, or go ahead and use your voice. What made a good boss? What made a bad boss? Lene, how about if I put you on the spot for a minute? Good boss, bad boss. What are some attributes?
Good boss, understanding.
Okay. Okay. So they
Listening.
understand you and they seek understanding.
And
Okay,
understand the role and the responsibilities.
Yeah, right. Okay, good. There's a popular term in the organizational leadership world that I live in executive coaching, and that is called perspective taking. The idea behind it is working hard to try to understand another's perspective. And when you do, you're more able to interact, you're more likely to be able to understand what makes them tick and then lead them better. So others.
I think a bad boss is someone who doesn't recognize that they actually work for you, the employee. Without the employee doing the work, the boss is just overhead.
That's so true, Sylvia. Yes. Who does the work? How does the work get done? Why is a boss even needed, or why is a team leader even needed if they're not leading and if the work's not getting done? So individual work has to get done. And if you look at a traditional hierarchy, there are people in management roles with direct reports reporting to them, and then others are reporting to them, and that's where a lot of the work gets done. And I have a slide. I don't think it's one of those that I took out, but it shows examples of a lot of companies, but not the majority of companies, who have turned the hierarchy upside down, the pyramid of upside down, with a CEO, let's say in a for-profit organization, or an executive director of a nonprofit at the top, or a senior pastor in a church, let's say, is at the top. There's only one or two of those, and then the work, then there are managers, and then there are individual contributors, and so on. Some of the better companies have flipped that upside down and put customers or the stakeholders they serve first, and then the frontline workers next, and leadership is there to provide support and resources so that the work gets done. So I appreciate your comment, Sylvia. And now we've got a whole bunch in the chat box, which I wasn't seeing quickly. Kindness, communicative. Yeah, communication is so critical. Kathy says, my best boss was one who trusted me and allowed me autonomy. So as in the first week on a job, you don't probably want a lot of autonomy. You need some hand holding. You need to be onboarded. You need to understand the nuts and bolts of the work that you've just been assigned. But as you get better and better at that work and take on more responsibility and are capable, you don't want to be micromanaged. And so that, the micromanagement term would fit into the worst boss category for sure. Able to communicate, Jeannie, yes. Joel says clear expectations and consistent application. Absolutely. Expectations, especially, I think a lot about setting clear expectations so that people know what to do now, tomorrow. Yeah. Coaching, yeah, absolutely. And so we'll actually talk a little bit about that later. Worst boss was one who clearly didn't respect women, Kathy said. Absolutely. Tom says helps employees be their best. And so part of coaching, getting to Rosemary's comment, is to create conditions, empowering conditions so that you understand people's strengths and where they need to develop and provide them the tools and training and opportunities to develop so that they can grow and be their best. And then also putting people based on their capabilities and strengths into roles where they can succeed and help the team best. Listening skills. I have that later somewhere, Debbie, asking thoughts, your thoughts about how to solve problems. And so not lording it over people, but collaborating with them on decision-making and on projects so that if you're an individual contributor, that your voice has been valued. Excellent boss was one who thanked me, Kathy says, for disagreeing with him and showing him a different perspective. So yeah, gently challenging those in the hierarchy, let's say above you, and if that's welcomed, one of the hallmark characteristics of a servant leader is to encourage feedback, welcome feedback, and then act on the feedback that is necessary for that leader to develop. I don't know, I need help. I was wrong and I'm sorry. Yeah, that's all great, Reverie. And Bill says great bosses are like great members of God's kingdom. They are servants of all. And so we'll get into this more, but that's our first opportunity to really interact. And thank you for that wonderful interaction. And so what is servant leadership? So get to the nuts and bolts of servant leadership, then I'll show you some visuals, which I had fun putting together. And then we'll get into, it won't be a breakout room per se, probably, Lene. I don't think we can do that since we're already in a breakout room. But we'll figure something out about this highly interactive pairing off session, and we may not pair off. We may have to just do it in the big group, and then some more. So, and I'll keep a track of the time. And Lene, feel free to send me texts or chat comments to give me updates on time if you'd like. So one of probably the face of the literature of servant leadership is a gentleman named Robert Greenleaf, who over the course of his life and sort of midlife became a Quaker. And he is associated with really being sort of the founding father of servant leadership. And it's now been co-opted by lots of folks who believe in what he started. And we'll get into some of that. But here's a definition, set of practices I'll start with that enriches the lives of individuals, which gets to some of the comments earlier, enriches the lives, builds better organizations. What does a good organization look like? And a more just and caring world. The best organizations create sustainable conditions that serve others. So every organization, in order to be sustainable, has to serve in some way. Another definition, and by my favorite new author, and that is ChatGPT, is servant leadership is a leadership philosophy and style that emphasizes the leader's primary role as a servant to others instead of traditional top down, that pyramid I was describing earlier. It flips it where the bottom of the pyramid is on a point, and where the leader is in the position of serving. So looking upwards in a sense and finding out what our stakeholders need, what the frontline workers need most to serve. And that's where you create the conditions for a more sustainable approach. A lot of books on servant leadership or the attributes and behaviors of servant leadership. Here are 6 of them, 4 of which I've read, 3 of which I've used in my MBA classes and/or undergraduate classes. I no longer teach undergraduates, but I was a management and leadership professor and still am a leadership professor in an executive MBA program. And these resonate. The whole idea of servant leadership, tuning into others, caring about what others think, perspective taking I mentioned earlier, and asking questions, and the whole idea of using coaching techniques, which I'll get to in a little bit, really resonates with most of my MBA students. I hesitate to say all. And so here's in Mark 9, and all of these scriptures you're well aware of, but I thought I'd pull scripture into this and link it. And if anybody wants to make a comment, feel free in the context of your work or previous work or in your volunteering. He called to the 12 and said to them, if anybody wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all, which was somewhat of the basis for Simon Sinek's book, or at least mimicked by Simon Sinek in his Leaders Eat Last book, which documents and cites lots of evidence, research studies that signal that people who have servant leadership attributes, which we'll get to in just a little bit, and some of the things that you've described in the chat box, tend to build stronger teams and more sustainable teams. So this is kind of the fun part of my time with you. What might servant leadership look like visually, and what signals are we sending in our leading, effective or ineffective leading? And this may not be you, but as you think about people in leadership roles, past or present, and let's maybe think to our churches, what signals are they sending, or are we sending? So here's one, more this than this. And you can see from Matthew 20, a site that also talks about that the Son came to serve and not be served and give his life. And so I think that you get what I'm getting at here. Here's another one. I don't think I had to put the arrows in, but I did anyway. More this than that. And those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Without naming names, I can think of several, let's call them, okay, so here is the best bosses, worst bosses. Okay, so here is Robert Greenleaf and his book, The Servant Leader. Here are some of those definitions that I was citing before. I'll quickly go through these. And here are the books that I was citing earlier. I'm so sorry you didn't see these. And I'm hoping you see the 6 books now. And
yes,
I've got a handout that I'll give you at the end. I also have a shorter handout that'll get to the interactive part of this, a different interactive part. And I cite, some scripture here and also some books. And I want to highlight Ken Blanchard up here. He has a lot of YouTube videos talking about servant leadership. Adam Grant wrote a best-selling book called Give and Take, and he documents research that shows that people who are more giving-oriented than taking-oriented in the long run build better teams and win. not in the early going, but over time, they're seen as and viewed as authentic, and that people want to be around givers. And then this book, Leadership and Self-Deception, cites studies by the Arbinger Institute and talks about being in the box, which is really self-oriented and worrying about my identity and status, and my own compensation and getting ahead, versus getting out of the box. Get out of the box and start looking outward and being other-oriented. And this is a book, The Leadership Challenge is a book that I've used several times, and I now just use their model. The book is a little bit long for my MBA classes. They really are overwhelmed with their own lives, and so I don't assign a lot of lengthy readings. But this book documents a 5-step, 5 exemplary practices of leaders, which include modeling the way, role modeling, inspiring a shared vision, so co-creating a vision for an organization or for a unit, challenging processes, which I'm hoping to do with you tonight. So challenging some of the ways you think about leading. And maybe you need to challenge some of the people that you know who are in leadership roles with some of what we'll talk about and what I'll share at the end in the handout. Encouraging the heart and enabling others to act, which gets to Kathy's comment earlier about autonomy. When people are ready, giving them the opportunity to grow and take on more responsibility and have more autonomy. Most leaders, most people in leadership roles, most people in managerial roles with direct reports do not have the luxury of doing a lot of individual contributor work. They need to let go, and in our case, let God and let go, so that the work gets done by the individual contributors. All right, now, what might servant leadership look like visually? Okay, so this, more like this, less like this, and here Matthew 20, just as the Son came to serve, not to be served, and so on, and gave his life. And so more of a humble humility is a big part of being servant leader. Here's one with some arrows that I referred to earlier, which you couldn't see. And that is this idea of status and materialism and getting promoted and thinking only of self is obviously the opposite of what a servant leader needs to do, and the signals a servant leader needs to send. Here's another one. And this gets to attending to one's flock and the parable about the lost sheep. And we know that we all feel better when we are served by others. We all feel better when we serve others, when we support others. It's time consuming to be a servant and to serve others. It may take us away from our planned activities and what we thought we were going to do today, and maybe even what we wanted to do today, but isn't it a great feeling? And emotions play a really important role in this. Here's another one, maybe one of your favorite movies, It's a Wonderful Life, and another favorite movie of mine, Wall Street, but not the role model I want to emulate, Gordon Gekko. And from Hebrews 6, God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown him as you have helped his people and continue to help him. And then this, I don't show the picture on the right to my MBA students, but the picture on the left, in the first class, in the first half hour, I show this picture and I say, what does this signify to you? So I'm going to ask you, what does this signify to you? The picture on the left. Let me preface it by saying, let's say there's a senior pastor who has just hired, or let me say it this way, who has 3 new volunteers to do very important work. I'm on the personnel committee. So for example, important work, right? And the senior pastor sits down with those 3 volunteers at the table on the left, versus the senior pastor sits down at the leather chair on the right behind a giant desk. what signal does it send? And I see that we've already got some really good input. Collaboration, conversation, respect for all. I love it. We're all in this together.
Equality.
Equality. Another word I'd like to say is egalitarian, right? Accessible. Yeah, Joel. Group. It's a group decision. It's a group collaboration. It's a group conversation. I want to hear what you have to say. I'm open to what you have to say, Rosemary. Indeed, indeed. This left side, servant leadership. Right side, hierarchical leadership, right? Same here. Flat organization on the left, hierarchical organization on the right. Everybody knows who's the boss. You don't have to lord it over them. You don't have to remind them. They always know who the boss is. If you flip the pyramid, the boss's role is to provide as much developmental and resources support as possible, and autonomy, offer autonomy so that the work can get done by others. Now, of course, I do have this. Okay, I do have the pyramids in here. I thought I took it out in the interest of time. And I'm looking at the time, Lene, and I think I'm good time-wise, very good. So we see some organizations here. You may or may not like some of these organizations, but a lot has been written about their leadership style and their leadership mantras. Some were started with a servant leadership mindset. Others adopted that leadership mindset as leadership changed. This is the idea that I was referring to earlier and I described earlier, not remembering that I put this slide in here. I have a whole bunch of extra slides that I took and put them at the bottom of this presentation. So if we have time, I might get to them, but I kind of doubt it. But this is that idea of it's management's role, it's the senior pastor's role, it's the executive director of a nonprofit's role, it's the CEO's role to provide as much developmental support, resources support, and make sure that people don't get overwhelmed, make sure that people don't burn out, and manage that. That workload is so, so critical to being a servant leader, and also to do it themselves, to not burn out, to not get overwhelmed, to have, and I'll say this to my MBA students in every one of my 9 classes that I hold from early March to May. I have 9 classes with my MBA students. I say it in every class. I make a point of saying it every class. Have more dialogue. And have more dialogue of the type that you all described in the chat box when I showed that round table and the 4 equal chairs. Have more collaborative dialogue. Ask for more and encourage more feedback. I want to know, after the end of this workshop, I want to know how I could have improved it. I think I have a sense for what goes well, but I have a blind spot for what I might have improved. Otherwise, I would have done it. I would have done it in my preparation. So as a leader, as a senior pastor, as a head of volunteers, as a deacon, if you have people reporting to you, volunteers reporting to you, ask for feedback. That's a hallmark characteristic of a servant leader. All right. More of this than this. Less about judgment. Okay, please don't roll your eyes. But one of my favorite lines from Ted Lasso is, be curious, not judgmental. And that works beautifully for professional coaching, the professional coaching I do. And I would encourage everybody to become more of a coach if you're not already. How do you become a coach in your work setting or working with volunteers? 4 steps. And I show this a little bit later, but I'm going to say them right now. How do you become a coach? Holistic listening. You don't have to write this down because I show it later. Holistic listening. What is holistic listening? Listening not just for words, but for tone, for energy shifts, for body language. That's number 1, holistic listening. Number 2, be curious, ask open-ended questions. How do open-ended questions start? Typically with what or how. not why. Why not why? It can feel judgmental. If you say, why didn't you do that? Or why didn't you think of this? That can feel very judgmental. The third is prompt for action. Prompt them if they've revealed a challenge and they haven't yet tackled it and they're capable of tackling it, have a dialogue about them committing to tackling it, to getting on with it, to move to not avoid that difficult conversation that they've been avoiding, for example, or the conflict that is giving them what I call conflict debt, the 30-pound weight that they're carrying around of conflict that's unresolved. Well, let's collaborate. Let's talk about how you can take that next step and resolve that conflict, or at least attempt to resolve that conflict. Really, really critical. Prompt for action. And the fourth is ask them, how are you going to hold yourself accountable so that you get done the actions that you're committing to, the actions that you say you're going to get to? So that one on the left, I thought it was a pretty good picture of somebody looking very curious, like, tell me more. I'm curious. What are you thinking about? What alternative are you considering? You've just told me the problem, which is blah, blah, blah. Here's the problem. What have you considered? So this gets to the much overused cliche. Are you going to hand them the answer, hand them the fish, or are you going to teach them how to fish? A leader should be a coach, in my view. A leader who uses coaching techniques builds capacity, problem-solving capacity. I'm going to stop there because I've shared several things. Does anybody have a comment, a verbal comment they want to use, or something in the chat box they want to share? What are you thinking? Is this challenging you? Or are you thinking about challenging someone who might benefit from some of the things that have been discussed so far? I've got time, Lene, to take a minute if anybody has something they want to share. I have to look around my camera, Lene, to see you. So you're right behind my camera. So
I just keep thinking about what a terrible boss my last boss was. We had a mutual dislike for each other, and it's really the reason why I retired early, because we could not work together.
Yeah. So was that Debbie that was saying that?
Yes.
That was Debbie. Hey, Debbie. So I didn't put this in a slide, but I do some research. I've done some research, and I've also explored research on why people leave jobs. And the single greatest reason people leave jobs, even during the pandemic, was because of a relationship, typically a toxic relationship with who? Typically a boss. But it could be a coworker as well. It's not money why most people leave jobs. It could be a factor, but it's almost always another person. Not another better opportunity. They cannot sleep at night. They can't stand going and seeing this person tomorrow, even if it's virtual. So thank you for sharing that. That is the single greatest reason why people leave work, according to the research that I've explored. Anybody else?
This is Stephanie.
Hey, Stephanie.
Hi. I'm enjoying this, and I wish I had been able to use this before I retired in all my jobs, because all I had were bad bosses. The pyramids that you showed. Now,
Yes.
I worked for the government. My husband was military. And I will say, you know, the one that starts, the one on the right, that is how the government works. That's how the military works.
Yeah.
I worked at the VA hospital, and our veterans were called customers, which was very demeaning because they were not customers. They were entitled because of the service that they provided, you know. So
Indeed.
I had a lot of arguments with my coworkers and my boss. No, none of us are customers. They are entitled. But I do know that working when I did not have the skills to teach my bosses how to be leaders, because I was not allowed to talk to them on a peer level. And if I tried, I was made, well, I got bad reviews.
Yeah.
But, sometimes if you could be a leader or a servant to your boss and teach your boss how to be a good leader, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, there's a term that some people use, upskilling, is
Oh.
basically training your boss. And so gently nudging your boss by sending them an article and saying, well, I found this fascinating, without pointing the finger or saying you're bad at this, or you could learn this, you could benefit from this. Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate that. And absolutely, we, have more dialogue with your boss about ways that they can improve, gently nudging them to think about ways that could be more effective. So I'm going to move on because now I've only got 9 minutes, Lene, and I want to move on to the last interactive part of this. More this than this. So research exploring teams, team leader trust and engagement found what I'm about to find, but this gets to Bill's comment, and Nancy too, I think, collaboration earlier. So more collaborative, more egalitarian, more around a round table where everybody knows who's the boss, or if there's a hierarchy, who the bosses are and who reports to who and all that, who has firing ability, who does the performance evaluation, and so on. But if we're sitting equally at a table and we're encouraging every voice equally, Google did a long 5-year study on, they're trying to find who the most effective teams were. And Charles Duhigg in the New York Times wrote about this several years ago. And it was called the Aristotle Project at Google. And what Google found when they studied the most effective teams didn't have the brightest people. Well, they're all smart at Google, but didn't have the brightest people, didn't have the highest IQs, weren't there the longest, didn't have the longest tenure, didn't have the most expertise. It was the teams that cared most deeply about each other, who created the most psychologically safe environment so that people could share their crazy ideas, their fears, their mistakes, so that nobody else would make that same mistake. All this vulnerability stuff. Those were the teams that were most cohesive, and they had one other characteristic, and that was they had roughly equal conversational turn taking. And that didn't mean that they waited for another person to talk. They often would talk over each other, but in an excited way that took the ball and ran with whoever was talking and added to it. And so these were messy, but caring teams, cared about each other deeply, wanted to spend time with each other outside of the workplace, would often talk about work outside of the workplace. Those are the teams that were most effective. And so one thing that they got to, and this is not from that study, but it kind of mimics the study, is, and I would be remiss as an academic not sharing you at least with you at least one study. This was a study by Marcus Buckingham. He used to be with Gallup. He's now with I can't see my screen as well as you can. ADP. I can see that research. And he did this with Ashley Goodall. He wrote this up with a big team. They found that teams, period, were more engaged. So when you form a team, if you have a project, the less you assign individual tasks to individuals, and you put pairs together, or you put a team together to try to figure out maybe the big task, the big project, you're more likely to have higher engagement. And when there's high trust in a team leader, the engagement is even higher. And we know from the literature, hundreds of studies, probably, maybe even thousands of studies on workplace engagement. When workplaces have more engaged workers, all kinds of downstream outcomes, positive outcomes occur. higher retention of those workers so they don't leave the organization, much higher productivity, much greater job satisfaction, which some call the gold standard of workplace outcomes. When workers are really satisfied with their work, they produce more, they have less stress typically, and they also manage their workloads better and they stay. So, all right, 7 o'clock, 5 minutes, right, Lene? All right, so here's a long laundry list of attributes, behaviors, and emphases of servant leaders. And I'm going to put in the chat box, assuming you pulled it up, I'm going to go to my next slide, and we were going to pair off and briefly share an Achilles heel, keeping you from being more of a servant leader. Consider sharing what you're willing to do to become more of a servant leader. And so we would need another 10 minutes for this, Lene, and we don't have that 10 minutes. But I'm going to share a couple of things. One is patience. I am working, Kathy, I think knows this, especially with my wife, Corey, I am working on becoming much more patient. I always have too much on my plate. And that's another thing, managing my workload and managing, just trying to get done what's really most important and urgent. Not all the other things on my plate. One project a day is great if I can accomplish that. Nancy says introversion can keep you from being more of a servant leader because, Nancy, and I'll run with that if I could, introverts may be reluctant to challenge others, may be reluctant to have more dialogue, may be reluctant to have that difficult conversation. And in order for you to be a wonderful and effective leader, you need to tackle all those things. And if you have a mindset of serving, that this is going to be helpful to getting things done and to my group, my team, then that is something that an introvert needs to get past. Rosemary also says being present. And so it's 7:03. So I'm going to go to my next slide and just show you some things. And you've got these in yours. How about how would a servant leader handle workload? How would a servant leader give and receive feedback? I've alluded to the giving or to receiving part already, encouraging feedback. And so one of the books that isn't servant oriented, but gets to this idea of really helping people grow is to care. It's called Radical Candor. It's to care personally and challenge people directly. And this gets to servant leaders too. We have less than 2 minutes before we go into the big room. Giving and receiving feedback, How do you handle conflict? How would a servant leader handle conflict? Discerning sources, understanding and managing emotions, being curious, and so on. Taking a learning mindset is really a hallmark characteristic of a good leader and someone who handles conflict well. How do you strengthen best practice or strengthen relationships? Well, vulnerability is one way. Having more dialogue, work-related and non-work-related dialogue. Here are the 4 coaching techniques. More non-work time with your people, with volunteers too. Modeling the behaviors you want to see. I got 60 seconds, Lene. I'm getting through it. Honoring the commitments.
The fast pace.
So I made a commitment to Judy Wilfong to do this workshop, and I'm here and I'm getting it done. And hopefully you're getting something, one nugget out of this, Debbie. I would love for you to take one nugget from this. Care deeply about the whole person, not just the worker. Okay. 35 seconds. And what about self-care? How would a servant leader handle self-care when they're under pressure, when they're overwhelmed, when illness strikes, and so on? How well do you attend to contemplative practices? Do you have a routine for contemplative practices? Sleep, exercise, nutrition, time in nature, and so on and so on. And I think I have a sense for what your takeaways are. Thank you. Thank you. We're heading back into the big room. Thanks for your great participation.